Hello my friends and welcome to this video today. So in today's video I want to talk about a camera because this camera here, it celebrates its 10th birthday this year. It is a Sony A7R, the second generation of this camera, the Mark II, and it was released all the way back in 2015. And why exactly this camera, you might ask? Basically all the way to the beginning of 2024 I used this camera for nearly all of my landscape and nature shots. So yeah, it is a pretty great camera, I believe, but if it still holds up in the year 2025, we will discuss in today's video, so let's get started. And yeah, as you could imagine, this is the second generation of mirrorless full-frame cameras from Sony. Basically, Sony started this whole thing with mirrorless full-frame cameras. And for example, the first generation of this camera, the Sony A7R Mark I, I've owned this camera also. It was released in 2013, but it had a lot of, basically issues. You know, first generation issues that most tech products have. It was still a pretty good and usable camera, but with this second generation, you know, I think all the issues that the first generation product might had, they were nearly all fixed. And yeah, as I said, if this camera is still great today, we will find out now. So when we talk about this camera, the Sony A7R Mark II, I have to share a personal story here first, because I bought this camera used back in 2017, and at this point I didn't own any money from photography, so it was basically just for my personal hobby and my personal passion of landscape photography. And ever since I bought this, I shot around, I believe around 100,000 pictures only with this camera. It still holds up pretty good, so at least this model that I have, it is really reliable. Obviously I cannot talk for any other camera out there, for any other Sony A7R Mark II out there, but at least my one is really reliable. And I've been traveling the world with this camera ever since, and yeah, I've used it until basically the start of 2024. At least when we talk about landscape photography. So this was basically my daily driver for more than 6 years. And it was just an amazing camera. For example, when you look behind me here, you can see a lot of pictures on this wall, my picture wall here, and all of them were shot with this camera. I have to update this wall sometime in the future. I will do another video about this as well. So yeah, with that said, let's start the video now. I will show you my best moments with this camera while I'm talking about the technical aspects and if it is still worth buying. So stick around and let's go. So let's start with one of the biggest advantages of this camera right away, the price. As I said, this camera is 10 years old and you can find some pretty good deals on the used market. For example, you will find cameras from all the way 5 to 6, 700 euros, all the way in this regime. And I think dollar prices might be similar. So this is honestly a great deal for a full frame mirrorless camera, which has still a relatively modern feel to it, I believe. So in this regard, this is a really good advantage. And for example, if you're someone who just wants to start out with landscape photography, or if you have an APS-C camera and want to upgrade to a full frame model, I think honestly, if you are looking for a good budget and value camera, this one might be the right thing for you. Another advantage of this camera is the compact size of it. When we talk about, basically used cameras from 10 to 12, 13 years ago, we often talk about, these DSLR cameras from that era, for example, from Canon or Nikon, which will also give you great deals sometimes, but they are huge. They are really big because they have this, mirror attachment basically. And you know, the Sony camera, it do not have all of this. You know, it is just the plain camera, as said, mirrorless obviously. So it is really compact. You can fit this basically everywhere. And even if you compare it to the modern Sony cameras, like for example the A7R V, they have a way bigger housing than the A7R II. So it is very well suited, for example, for travel and nature and landscape photography, because you know, there are situations where you have to walk many miles and every gram counts basically, and then you will be happy to have a lightweight and small camera. Another advantage would be the sensor. It is a 42 megapixel sensor, and honestly that is more than enough for anything. You know, the R's in A7R, for example, it always stands for resolution, so it always is and was the basically higher megapixel variant of the standard cameras. And same goes for this obviously, and 42 megapixels even in 2025 is honestly more than enough than you could ever need. I mean, you will need a lens that supports all these megapixels in the first place, and I think, yeah, you might find the bottleneck there sooner than you will find the bottleneck with the 42 megapixels on your sensor. And even the newer Sony A7R models, like for example the A7R IV and 5, they will come with a 63 megapixel sensor, which sound like a lot, but honestly, if you look at the pictures, you will not see any difference. I can promise you that. I have both here, and basically when you do not look at the basically files and the data there, you will not find a difference by just looking at the photo. And when we talk about stuff like the dynamic range, for example, you will also find that this camera is still pretty modern and pretty well holds up to modern cameras as well. Because, for example, you will get a 13-stop dynamic range, around 13-stop dynamic range on the Sony A7R II, while even the newest models only have, for example, like 14 or 15 stops. So this is definitely an improvement, but we are talking about cameras that will cost you like 10 times as much sometimes. So I think 13 stops is still pretty great. So this camera, when we talk about dynamic range, it will perform great, especially when we talk about the lower ISO regime of things. Another thing is that it has in-body image stabilization, which sounds like standard today, but it was pretty rare back in the days when this camera was released basically. So honestly, this is pretty cool as well. So all in all, this camera is very capable when we talk about, for example, landscape photography, where you have the time and possibility to do, for example, longer exposures. Or if you have a studio and you will do studio work with it, I think this camera is still pretty great and feels pretty modern. So let's now talk about the limitations and disadvantages of this camera, because obviously in the last 10 years there have been improvements to the cameras, which this camera will not feature. So let's talk about that now. The best example of that would be the autofocus system. It is way slower than today's standards basically, especially when we talk about tracking objects, tracking moving objects. And in this regard, this camera feels kind of old. Autofocus existed back then, but it was still pretty basic and less reliable compared to newer models. So this camera will not be your best friend when we talk about sports, wildlife photography, or action photography, everything in this regime. You will not be very happy with this camera, honestly. So I can not recommend buying this if you want to do this kind of photography. To commentate this, you only have a 5 frames per second burst mode, which is, for landscape photography more than you would ever need. But as I said, for action photography, it is not really much. You will find way better cameras today. So in this regard, this is also not the newest standard that you will find there. Another thing that you should consider is the low light performance. Newer cameras tend to have way better low light performance. For example, this camera, I found it to be usable to around, I believe, 3200 ISO, which will give you some noise, but it's still pretty usable. But keep in mind there, you have great post-processing capabilities nowadays. You will get all the AI denoising features, for example, with Photoshop and Lightroom, which works just great. And honestly, this isn't the biggest downer today, because you can just fix the pictures in the post-process. And I know super modern cameras, they all have this, AI features included, for example AI autofocus as well, or AI denoising, but obviously this camera from 10 years ago will not have this. But still, you can do so much with the pictures afterwards that I believe you still can consider buying this camera when you, for example, want to do astrophotography. So one more thing I wouldn't necessarily recommend this camera for is cinematography. It can make videos, it can make 4K videos, but only up to 30 frames per second, which isn't the biggest downer there, honestly. For social media and stuff like that, for most things, I think 30 frames per second is well enough. I mean, this very video only has 30 frames per second. But the biggest downside here is that it really only shoots in 8-bit. And when you compare 8-bit to 10-bit, it is a huge difference. Everyone can tell you that basically. And in this regard, 8-bit is really kind of outdated, especially when you really want to shoot high quality videos. So all in all, I can say it is not well suited for serious work nowadays, and I wouldn't recommend buying this camera for video purposes. Some other things that might be important to you are, basically the user interface. You don't have a touchscreen, for example, so you will not have, for example, focus control via the touchscreen, which can come really handy. in some situations, and you have this very old Sony menu basically, which is known for not being very easily to understand. Basically, it is not really intuitive. You know, everyone who's using Sony cameras can tell you that nowadays they try to fix it at least a little bit, but yeah, other pen manufacturers even at that time were better. However, I think you can get used to it, and it is not the biggest downer there, but all in all it will give you slower handling with the camera compared to newer models, or as I said, even models of this era. So yeah, keep that in mind. So all in all, what can I say about this camera? Is it still worth buying in 2025? And I think the answer is yes, but only for certain areas of photography. For example, if you want to do landscape pictures, and if that is your main hobby basically, and you don't want to shoot, for example, wildlife or other fast moving objects in this regard. So if you only want to do landscape photography, this camera still holds up pretty good, and you will not see a difference in your pictures compared to modern cameras, at least for example when you use the same lens. And this is also one thing, lenses for full frame cameras tend to be more expensive than the APS-C cameras, but when you want to switch to a full frame camera, if you want to start out with photography or landscape photography and you don't want to spend thousands of dollars, for example, you will find this camera for 500 euros, you will get yourself a 24 to 105mm lens. I've done a video about that a couple of weeks ago. It will also cost you around 600 euros. So you basically have a landscape and nature photography setup there for around 1000 to 1200 euros, and you will get great results from that. And I think honestly you will not get much better than this. And obviously there are a lot of cameras out there from this era who will give you basically also a good value for your money when you want to start out or when you want to upgrade to a full frame camera. And what I want to say with this video is that an old camera doesn't mean that it will create old looking pictures or that it will feel outdated in your photos. You can still create amazing things with that. And basically that is the main point of this video. And obviously, as I said, I talked about the Sony A7R II today because this is the camera that I've been using for many years. And as I said, I still use this as a backup camera even to this day. So I think this speaks for itself. So when you want to choose your next camera, or if you just want to start out making photos and joining this beautiful hobby basically, then I can definitely recommend looking in the used market from that era. So with that said, I thank you so much for watching this video today. And I have many other videos about photography related topics over on my channel, so feel free to check them out as well. I've also linked a few here. And I hope I see you in next week's video. So I see you then, and goodbye.